sometimes the pull of curiosity can lead us to places we were never meant to go. For one kid in Littleton, Colorado, an adventure to explore an abandoned mansion near Jackass Hill quickly turned into a nightmare. It was nearly midnight when the young adventurer crept out with nothing but a flashlight and his bike. He rode down the deserted road, adrenaline battling caution with each pedal stroke. As the kid stood before the mansion, a wave of hesitation washed over him. The house was immense, bigger than any other around it, casting a shadow over the field nearby. It seemed out of place, both in size and atmosphere. What had once been an ambitious project, a mansion promising grandeur and status, had somehow slipped into decay, left to rot unfinished, forgotten by everyone except curious souls like his. He took a deep breath, feeling his heart pound against his chest. The stillness around him made the night feel colder, as if the air was holding its breath along with him. He pushed the door open, and to his surprise, it swung inward with eerie ease. For a moment, he hesitated, but curiosity was stronger than caution. He stepped over the threshold, leaving the door ajar behind him, just in case he needed a quick escape. Inside, the air was thick and musty, filled with the stale scent of neglect. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing years of dust and abandonment. Pieces of furniture lay in fragments across the floor, some broken beyond recognition, others draped in sheets, their ghostly forms adding to the unsettling atmosphere. It felt like the mansion itself was hiding secrets, with every wall and every shadow holding memories that it would never reveal. Each step he took echoed through the hollow space, amplified in the silence. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and the sound made him wince, as though he were disturbing something that had been left in peace for too long. He moved slowly, tiptoeing across the open entryway, feeling as though he were intruding. His footsteps were tentative, barely more than whispers against the dust-covered floor. Every so often, he paused, straining his ears to listen for any sign of life, half expecting someone, his mother, maybe, or even the workers who had long since abandoned the project, to appear in the doorway behind him, demanding to know what he was doing there. As he ventured deeper, the darkness around him seemed to thicken, pressing in on him from all sides. Shadows clung to the walls and stretched across the floor, twisting into unnatural shapes as his flashlight beam caught them. At the edge of his vision, things seemed to move, disappearing whenever he turned to look. It was as if the house itself were alive, breathing and watching, waiting to see what he would do next. He swept his flashlight over the peeling wallpaper, faded and curling at the edges, the colors barely discernible under the layers of dust. It was strange to think of this place once being filled with life, with people moving in and out, laughing, making plans for the future. But now, that history was nothing more than a faint memory, one that the mansion seemed reluctant to give up. The cold seemed to seep into his bones, and the silence was so complete that it felt oppressive, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. Each passing second only heightened his awareness of how alone he was, surrounded by nothing but shadows and silence, with no one to hear him if he called for help. And yet, despite the fear prickling at the back of his mind, he felt an undeniable pull to keep going, to explore just a little bit further. After all, he was here, wasn't he? And he hadn't come all this way to turn back now. As he moved deeper into the house, the oppressive silence began to shift. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, like a trick of his mind. But the longer he stood in the darkness, the clearer it became, soft creaks, as though the house itself were breathing, settling, shifting. Each sound seemed to come from just beyond the edge of his flashlight's reach, inviting him to look closer, to step further into the shadows. The floorboards creaked and groaned beneath his feet, the sound sharp in the stillness. He stopped and held his breath, listening. For a moment, all was silent again, and he tried to shake off the feeling that he was being watched. But then, just as he took a step, he heard it, a faint whisper, echoing through the walls. His flashlight trembled in his hand as he froze, listening intently, trying to decipher the sound. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. It seemed to seep from the very walls, surrounding him, pulling him deeper into the mansion's secrets. The whispers grew louder, winding through the rooms, bouncing off the walls and filling the air with a soft, unearthly murmur. They were just low enough that he couldn't make out the words, but there was an unmistakable urgency in their tone, as if the voices were trying to communicate, trying to lure him forward, deeper into the unknown. Goosebumps prickled along his skin, and he fought the urge to turn back, to leave and pretend he'd never come. He forced himself to take another step, and then another, his senses heightened, every sound amplified. Shadows seemed to ripple along the walls, twisting and bending in ways that defied logic, as if they were alive, moving independently of his flashlight's beam. The darkness felt almost tangible, like it was reaching out for him, eager to pull him in and swallow him whole. The air grew colder, and he could feel a chill creeping up his spine, settling into his bones. His breath came in short gusts, clouding in the cold, stagnant air. Every instinct told him to turn back, to run, but something kept him rooted in place, a twisted mix of fear and curiosity. He strained to listen again, and in the silence that followed, he could almost swear the whispers were calling his name. He had barely managed to steady himself when the whispers stopped, suddenly and completely. The silence was so absolute that it pressed on his ears, thick and suffocating. His heart pounded in his chest, loud and frantic in the emptiness around him. It was as if the house itself had fallen silent, watching him, waiting for his next move. He swallowed, gripping his flashlight so tightly that his knuckles turned white, every instinct screaming for him to leave. But he couldn't seem to move, held in place by an unseen force, a morbid curiosity that kept him anchored to the spot. Then, he heard it, a familiar voice, soft and laced with urgency, drifting from the depths of the darkness. "Come here, Trute. I hurt my leg. Help me." The words echoed through the room, chilling him to the bone. It was his mother's voice, clear and unmistakable, and for a fleeting moment, relief washed over him. But that relief quickly soured, morphing into a cold, crawling dread. Something was wrong, deeply, horribly wrong. He replayed the voice in his mind, dissecting each word, each inflection. His mother's voice, normally warm and full of life, sounded hollow, strained, as though someone were imitating her, a puppet's voice, empty of emotion, twisted into a sick imitation. There was something off in the way it lingered on each word, the syllables drawn out, distorted, as if it had been forced to learn human speech and hadn't quite mastered it. A sickening cackle followed, piercing the silence and sending a shiver down his spine. It was a laugh, but there was nothing human about it. It was high-pitched and sharp, like the screech of metal on metal, blending with a low, guttural growl that made his skin crawl. The sound reverberated through the mansion, filling every corner with its twisted mockery. It was the laugh of something that knew fear intimately, something that fed on it. The darkness around him seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on him, as if whatever was mimicking his mother's voice were drawing closer, waiting just beyond the reach of his flashlight. He wanted to call out, to shout his mother's name, but his throat felt tight, strangled by a fear he couldn't shake. Instead, he stood there, paralyzed, his body refusing to move, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the unnatural sound. A moment passed, then another. The silence was broken only by the faint hum of his flashlight, casting long shadows that danced along the walls, as if mocking him. And then, without warning, the silence shattered again, a scream, raw and piercing, slicing through the air. It was a sound unlike anything he'd ever heard, a horrible mixture of a woman's desperate wail and the shrill whinny of an animal in pain, twisted together into a single, gut-wrenching sound that clawed its way into his mind. The scream echoed through the house, filling every corner, every crevice, with its terror. He stumbled back, his heart hammering, his legs frozen in place. But somewhere deep within him, he knew that whatever was making that sound was coming closer, lurking in the darkness, waiting to reveal itself. And as his flashlight trembled in his hands, he realized he was no longer alone in the house. He stood frozen, his mind blank with terror, his eyes fixed on the spot where the scream had echoed from. The silence crept back, suffocating and thick, as though the house were holding its breath along with him. Every instinct urged him to run, to turn and flee, but he couldn't. His feet felt cemented to the ground, his body numb and immobile, as if something unseen held him in place. Just as he felt the first shiver of movement return to his limbs, something stirred in the shadows. His flashlight beam flickered, casting a faint glow across the far end of the room. There, stepping out from the darkness, was a figure, a towering, twisted shape that seemed to shift and stretch with each step, a grotesque silhouette that defied all reason. It was tall, unnaturally so, its head nearly brushing the ceiling, and its body was impossibly lean yet muscular, like something out of a nightmare brought to life. He forced his gaze upward, inch by inch, and his stomach turned. The creature's face was a horrific sight, a skeletal semblance of a deer's head stripped of skin, with hollow, black pits where eyes should have been. Those empty sockets seemed to stare straight into him, devoid of any warmth, any trace of life. It looked like something that had been ripped apart and stitched back together by cruel, unsteady hands. Each part of it was out of place, fractured, held together by an unnatural will alone. For a long, agonizing moment, he stared into those empty eyes, his heart pounding as he struggled to draw breath. Then, the creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and from the hollow of its throat came a single, distorted word that sent a bolt of terror through him: run. The voice was his mother's, twisted and warped, laced with a cruel mockery. Hearing that single word, he snapped out of his trance. His body obeyed before his mind could fully catch up, legs pumping, heart pounding as he turned and sprinted toward the door. He didn't look back, not even when he heard the soft scrape of footsteps behind him, following him, matching his speed. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he tore through the darkness, the creature's voice echoing in his mind, urging him to run, faster, farther, anything to escape the horror that lingered just behind him. His feet barely touched the floor as he bolted through the mansion's endless dark hallways, his pulse a drumbeat in his ears. The walls seemed to close in on him, shadows reaching out like skeletal fingers, clutching at his clothes as he ran. Behind him, he could hear the creature's steady footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if it knew he couldn't truly escape. The main door loomed ahead, faintly illuminated by the moonlight spilling in from outside. Just a few more steps, he thought, desperation fueling his every move. His legs burned, his breath ragged, but he didn't dare slow down. The creature's presence pressed on him, closer with each second, and the chill of its gaze felt like ice on the back of his neck. Finally, he reached the door and practically threw himself through it, stumbling into the night air. Without looking back, he raced to his bike, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the handlebars. The creature's voice still echoed in his mind, "Run." His heart pounded as he gripped the handlebars, his whole body trembling. Without waiting to catch his breath, he pushed off, pedaling with every ounce of strength he had left. The quiet of the abandoned mansion was swallowed by the roar of the wind as he sped down the empty road. He glanced back once, just once, and saw nothing but darkness. But the memory of that twisted figure, those hollow, black eyes, stayed with him. He knew, with chilling certainty, that he would never return to the mansion, and he'd never forget the nightmare lurking within its walls. He didn't stop pedaling until he was back in his own neighborhood, his legs aching, his lungs burning, but he didn't care. The streets were empty and silent, every house dark and asleep, oblivious to the terror he'd just experienced. He didn't feel safe until he reached his own house, his familiar porch light casting a warm glow. Only then did he finally slow down, dismounting his bike with shaky hands. The world felt surreal, as though he'd crossed into some nightmare realm and barely managed to escape. Even now, as he stood in the familiar glow of his street, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the creature's hollow eyes still lingered in the dark, waiting just out of sight. He cast one last glance toward the distant silhouette of Jackass Hill, the mansion barely visible in the night, and he shivered. Once inside, he locked the door, double-checked every window, and stood in the quiet, listening, half expecting to hear that twisted voice calling his name from the shadows. But there was only silence. As he crept through the dark house, he felt the weight of exhaustion settle over him. The adrenaline began to drain from his body, leaving behind a cold emptiness. In his room, he finally allowed himself to breathe, to sit on his bed and process what he'd just seen. Every detail was burned into his memory, the creature's grotesque, skeletal face, the empty black pits of its eyes, and that final, chilling word, "Run." The voice echoed in his mind, distorted and hollow, leaving a lingering dread he couldn't shake. In the days that followed, he avoided Jackass Hill entirely, too afraid to even glance in its direction. At night, he would lie awake, listening for any sounds outside his window, his heart racing with each creak of the house. He tried to convince himself it had all been a bad dream, but the memory of that creature, its twisted form stepping from the shadows, haunted him. Finally, he searched online, hoping to find answers, something to explain what he had encountered. What he found was both relieving and terrifying, a creature described in local legends, a warning whispered in dark corners of the internet, the Wendigo. A relentless, hungry spirit, forever hunting, forever haunting. And as he read, he realized something that would haunt him for years to come. He had gone looking for the unknown, and it had found him. And somewhere out there, lurking in the shadows, it was waiting. Days turned into weeks, but Trude couldn't escape the memory of that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it, the hollow, eyeless gaze of the creature, the twisted, skinless face like some macabre mask. He couldn't shake the sound of that voice, the word "run," lingering in his mind like a ghost, tormenting him. Each time he tried to push it away, it seemed to only dig deeper, rooting itself in his thoughts. He started to feel its presence everywhere. In the dark corners of his room, in the faint creaks of the house at night, even in the gentle rustle of leaves outside his window. Every shadow felt alive, every noise held a sinister edge. The creature, though far away in the abandoned mansion, seemed to have followed him back home, lingering just out of sight, waiting. Some nights, he'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced he could hear its distorted laugh echoing faintly through his window. As the days went by, Trute found himself visiting online forums and paranormal websites, seeking any bit of information he could find. He read about sightings of creatures that roamed the woods, entities that fed on fear, beings that lured the unsuspecting with promises and tricks. And in his search, he found accounts eerily similar to his own, a deer-like monster, tall and twisted, with eyes like black pits and a voice that mimicked those it hunted. The descriptions were chillingly familiar, all pointing to the same terrifying legend, the Wendigo. Learning the creature's name was both a relief and a curse. Knowing what he'd encountered made it real in a way he couldn't ignore. The legend described it as a spirit of insatiable hunger, a predator of the soul, forever wandering in search of new prey. It was drawn to fear and desperation, feeding off the helplessness of those it ensnared. The knowledge that he'd crossed paths with something ancient and monstrous haunted him, but there was a small comfort in knowing he'd escaped. Yet the fear lingered. He knew he had been lucky, that he'd come away unscathed. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that somewhere, hidden in the shadows, the creature was still out there, watching, waiting. And as he lay in bed each night, his room shrouded in darkness, Trute knew one thing for certain: he would never venture near Jackass Hill again. Some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed, and he'd glimpsed a world that was far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Months later, Trute still hadn't spoken a word to anyone about that night. He didn't know how to explain it, who would believe him? The experience had settled deep within him, like a wound that refused to heal. On the outside, he looked like any other kid going about his days, laughing with friends, doing homework, riding his bike. But inside, he felt changed, his mind forever scarred by the sight of that hollow-eyed creature. Sometimes, he'd catch himself staring out his window at night, his gaze drawn to the faint outline of Jackass Hill in the distance. He'd shudder, imagining that dark figure standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. Even though he'd vowed never to go near the mansion again, he still felt its pull, a morbid curiosity mixing with fear, like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. His nights were restless, haunted by vivid nightmares where he'd find himself back inside the mansion, the air thick with the scent of decay. In the dreams, he'd hear his mother's voice calling him, luring him deeper into darkness, only for the voice to twist and contort into that terrible mimicry, urging him to run. He'd wake with a start, drenched in sweat, the creature's skeletal face still vivid in his mind, its voice echoing. Trute knew he would never forget what he'd seen, that the creature had left a mark on him. It was a reminder that some things in this world were best left undisturbed, that there were mysteries better left unsolved. And though he tried to move on, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Wendigo's gaze would forever be upon him, watching from the shadows, a dark reminder of the night he'd come face to face with terror itself.